The letter trembled in Rhett Morgan's calloused hands as the stage rumbled away, leaving nothing but dust clouds and the petite figure of a woman standing beside a single trunk. The Montana Territory wind tugged at her bonnet, revealing honey-brown curls as she surveyed the small town of Whispering Pines with uncertain eyes. Rhett swallowed hard, squinting against the late afternoon sun of April 1876. This was his mail-order bride, his last desperate attempt to build a life worth living after 5 years of backbreaking solitude on his struggling cattle ranch. But standing there, watching her slender shoulders square with determination, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. The advertisement had seemed simple enough. Rancher seeks bride. 30 acres, modest home, honest work. He hadn't mentioned his own shortcomings, the nightmares from the war, the scars both visible and hidden, the crushing loneliness that had driven him to this desperate measure. And she hadn't mentioned hers. Bethany Collins clutched her small satchel tighter as she scanned the dusty main street of Whispering Pines. The stagecoach journey had been long and arduous, nearly 3 weeks from Boston to this remote frontier town. Her body ached from the constant jostling, but her spirit remained unbroken. This was her chance, perhaps her only chance for a life beyond pity and institutions. She saw him then, a tall figure in worn denims and a faded blue shirt, studying her with an intensity that made her stomach flutter. His strong jaw was darkened by stubble, and a battered brown Stetson shaded eyes she couldn't quite make out. Was this the man she'd agreed to marry? Rhett approached cautiously, rehearsing his greeting. The woman before him was prettier than he'd expected, delicate features, wide eyes the color of spring violets, and a quiet dignity in her posture despite the dust of travel clinging to her plain blue dress. "Miss Collins?" he asked when he reached her. "I'm Rhett Morgan." Bethany didn't respond. Her eyes followed the movement of his lips, but her expression remained politely blank. Rhett frowned slightly, repeating himself a bit louder. "Miss Collins?" "Bethany Collins." The young woman nodded, reaching into her pocket to withdraw a small slate and chalk. She wrote quickly, her handwriting neat and precise, then turned it toward him. "I am Bethany Collins. I cannot hear you. I am deaf since childhood." The words hit Rhett like a physical blow. Deaf. Nothing in their correspondence had mentioned this. His mind raced through their exchanged letters, the careful penmanship, the thoughtful questions about ranch life, her candid admissions about having no family and seeking a fresh start, but not a single mention of her inability to hear. Bethany watched his face carefully, reading the shock and confusion there. She'd seen that expression countless times before. Her shoulders slumped slightly as she wrote again on her slate. "If you wish to void our agreement, I understand. I can return on tomorrow's stage." Something in her resigned acceptance pierced Rhett more deeply than surprise had. He'd been judged plenty himself for his scars, for the slight limp from a Gettysburg bullet, for the nightmares that sometimes woke him screaming. The idea of sending this woman back east because she couldn't hear seemed suddenly cruel beyond measure. Bethany watched as emotions played across the rancher's weathered face. She'd been a fool to hope, to believe that a man who'd never seen her would accept her completely. In Boston, even the kindest people had eventually tired of the effort required to communicate with her. Why would this frontier rancher be any different? To her surprise, Rhett gently took the slate from her hands. His movements were awkward, uncertain, as he wrote his response. "Welcome to Whispering Pines. My wagon is over there." It wasn't acceptance or rejection, just simple practicality. Night would fall soon, and regardless of what came next, she needed shelter. Bethany nodded, relief washing through her. At least he wasn't sending her away immediately. Rhett lifted her trunk effortlessly, carrying it to a weathered wagon hitched to 2 patient draft horses. He helped Bethany climb onto the wooden seat, acutely aware of her light touch on his arm as she steadied herself. As they rode out of town, Bethany took in the vast Montana landscape spreading before them, rolling grasslands giving way to distant mountains still capped with snow. The spring air carried the scent of wildflowers and fresh growth. It was beautiful in its rawness, so different from Boston's crowded streets and sooty air. Rhett found himself stealing glances at his companion. Her profile was delicate but determined, her posture straight despite obvious fatigue. What kind of courage had it taken for her to travel across the country to marry a stranger? and to do so while unable to hear? The realization humbled him. After nearly an hour of travel, they crested a gentle rise, and Rhett's ranch came into view. It wasn't much, a modest two-room cabin with a small barn and corral nearby, a vegetable garden struggling against the elements, and about 30 head of cattle grazing in the distance. But it was his, paid for with blood and sweat and stubborn perseverance. Bethany's eyes widened as she took in what was to be her new home. The cabin was small but solid, with smoke curling from the stone chimney and wildflowers growing near the front steps. A large oak tree provided afternoon shade, and beneath it sat a rough-hewn bench. It was nothing like the crowded tenements of Boston or the stark institution where she'd spent part of her childhood, but it had a welcoming simplicity that touched her heart. When the wagon stopped, Rhett helped her down, their hands lingering for an extra moment. He led her inside, watching nervously as she examined the main room with its stone fireplace, wooden table and chairs, and shelves lined with a few books and necessities. A curtain separated this room from what she assumed was the bedroom. The awkwardness between them was palpable. Rhett ran a hand through his hair, wishing he knew what to say, how to explain that he needed time to think. Bethany seemed to understand his dilemma, pulling out her slate again. "I can prepare supper if you show me your supplies." Grateful for the practical suggestion, Rhett nodded, showing her the small pantry and the pump that brought water into a basin. As Bethany removed her bonnet and rolled up her sleeves, Rhett retreated outdoors to tend the horses and bring in more firewood, his mind churning with confusion and uncertainty. By the time he returned, Bethany had transformed simple ingredients into a hearty stew. The cabin smelled of herbs and warmth, and the table was set with his mismatched dishes. She'd found a jar of wildflowers to place in the center, a touch of grace he hadn't known his rough home needed. They ate in silence that wasn't quite uncomfortable. Occasionally, Bethany would write something on her slate, a question about the ranch, about the nearest neighbors, about the harsh Montana winters she'd heard of. Rhett would respond in writing, his answers brief but honest. He found himself noticing things about her: the graceful movement of her hands, the intelligent sparkle in her violet eyes, the way she observed everything with keen attention. After the meal, Bethany wrote, "Where shall I sleep tonight?" The question brought their uncertain situation into sharp focus. Rhett felt heat rise in his face as he wrote back, "You take the bedroom. I'll sleep by the fire." Bethany nodded, relief evident in her expression. She hadn't expected him to insist on marriage immediately, but she'd heard stories of frontier men who weren't so patient or honorable. Later, as Rhett stretched out on a bedroll near the dying embers, he stared at the ceiling, listening to the night sounds of the prairie. Through the thin curtain, a candle still burned in the bedroom where Bethany was presumably writing in the journal he'd glimpsed among her belongings. What was he to do? He'd saved for 3 years to afford a mail-order bride, desperate for companionship and help with the endless work of the ranch. But he'd never considered that his bride might face challenges of her own. Could a deaf woman survive the dangers of frontier life? Could she run the ranch if something happened to him? Could they build a life together without the simple luxury of spoken words? Most troubling was the question of whether she'd been deliberately deceptive. Why hadn't she mentioned her deafness in her letters? The thought nagged at him until sleep finally claimed him in the early hours of morning. Rhett woke to the scent of coffee and bacon. For a disoriented moment, he thought he was dreaming. It had been years since he'd awakened to breakfast prepared by anyone else. Sitting up, he saw Bethany at the small stove, her hair neatly braided down her back, already dressed in a simple work dress. She turned, sensing his movement, and offered a hesitant smile. Something about that smile, vulnerable yet hopeful, stirred emotions Rhett wasn't prepared to examine. He nodded in greeting, quickly pulling on his boots. Over breakfast, Rhett wrote on the slate that he needed to check on a pregnant heifer. Bethany immediately wrote back asking if she could accompany him. Surprised but pleased by her interest, he agreed. The morning air was crisp and clear as they walked to the small pasture where Rhett had separated the expectant mother from the herd. Bethany moved confidently beside him, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, drinking in the beauty of the land in early morning light. The black and white heifer was lying in the shade of a cottonwood, her sides heaving with contractions. Rhett knelt beside her, checking her progress with practiced hands. He was pleasantly surprised when Bethany knelt opposite him, her expression showing concern but no disgust or fear. When he gestured that the birth was proceeding normally, Bethany nodded, settling on the ground beside him to wait. They sat in companionable silence as the sun climbed higher, the heifer occasionally lowing in discomfort. After nearly an hour, the first signs of the calf appeared. Rhett moved quickly to assist, and without being asked, Bethany helped holding the heifer's head, fetching water from the nearby stream, following Rhett's pantomimed instructions with remarkable intuition. When the wobbly calf finally stood on unsteady legs and found its mother's milk, Bethany's face glowed with wonder. She reached out tentatively to stroke the calf's damp head, her smile so radiant that Rhett found himself smiling in return. On their walk back to the cabin, Rhett realized something had shifted between them. They had worked together seamlessly, communicating through gestures and expressions, united in purpose. For the first time, he began to see possibilities rather than problems. That afternoon, as Bethany helped him with chores around the ranch, Rhett found himself studying her methods of coping with her silence. She was constantly alert, her eyes tracking movements that his ears would have warned him about. She'd clearly developed a heightened awareness of her surroundings that compensated for her lack of hearing. At supper, Rhett finally asked the question that had troubled him since her arrival. Taking the slate, he wrote, "Why didn't you tell me you were deaf in your letters?" Bethany's face flushed, and for a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer. Then she took the slate, her chalk moving swiftly. "I tried twice before. Both men canceled our agreements when they learned. I was afraid. I'm sorry for the deception." The simple honesty of her words struck him deeply. How desperate must she have been to travel across the country to marry a stranger? And how much rejection had she faced before taking such a risk? Rhett wrote back, "What happened to your hearing?" "Scarlet fever when I was 7. My parents died in the same outbreak. I was sent to an asylum afterward." The stark facts of her past rendered in chalk dust made Rhett's complaints about his own life seem trivial. An orphaned deaf girl in an institution, he could scarcely imagine the loneliness she must have endured. "How did you learn to read and write so well?" he asked. A hint of pride entered Bethany's expression. "There was a kind teacher at the asylum. She believed deaf people could learn. She taught me to read lips a little too, but it's difficult, especially with strangers." They continued their chalk conversation late into the evening. Rhett learned that Bethany had worked as a seamstress in Boston after leaving the asylum at 16, living in a boarding house for working women. She'd seen the mail order bride advertisements as her only chance for a real home and family. "No one in Boston wanted to marry a deaf woman," she wrote. "They thought I was simple-minded or cursed." Rhett's hand tightened around the chalk. "They were fools," he wrote, surprising himself with the vehemence behind the words. Over the next few days, they settled into a routine. Bethany proved herself capable and hardworking, transforming the neglected cabin into a proper home. She discovered a treadle sewing machine gathering dust in a corner and soon had it working smoothly, mending Rhett's threadbare clothes and making curtains from fabric she found in her trunk. Rhett, meanwhile, found himself inventing ways to communicate beyond the slate. He developed hand signals for common needs: water, food, danger, come here, and was astonished at how quickly Bethany caught on, even suggesting improvements to his makeshift system. On their 5th evening together, a violent thunderstorm rolled across the plains. Rhett watched as Bethany moved calmly about the cabin, seemingly oblivious to the crashes of thunder that had always set his nerves on edge since the war. When a particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated the room, followed immediately by a deafening thunderclap, Rhett instinctively flinched, but Bethany only noticed when she turned and saw his reaction. She tilted her head questioningly, and Rhett realized with sudden clarity that she experienced the world so differently from him. The sounds that haunted his dreams, cannon fire, men screaming, the terrible whistle of incoming shells, couldn't reach her. Her silence was occasionally a gift. The next morning dawned clear and fresh. As they ate breakfast, Rhett made a decision. Taking the slate, he wrote, "I'm going to town today for supplies. Would you like to come?" Bethany hesitated, then wrote, "People will stare when they realize I'm deaf." "Let them," Rhett wrote back, feeling unexpectedly protective. "You're my..." He paused, chalk hovering over the slate. What was she to him? Not quite a wife, but more than a housekeeper or companion. Finally, he simply wrote, "You're with me." The ride to town was pleasant, the landscape vibrant with spring growth. Rhett found himself pointing out landmarks to Bethany, the creek where he fished, the bluff where eagles nested, the distant mountain range that glowed purple at sunset. Her obvious delight in these discoveries made him see his familiar surroundings with fresh appreciation. Whispering Pines was busy with Saturday commerce when they arrived. Rhett helped Bethany down from the wagon, conscious of the curious glances from townspeople. Most knew he'd sent for a mail-order bride, but few had seen her arrival or learned of her condition. They visited the general store first, where Mr. Peterson greeted them enthusiastically. "So this is the new Mrs. Morgan. Pleased to meet you, madam." When Bethany didn't respond to his booming welcome, Peterson looked confused. Rhett cleared his throat. "Miss Collins can't hear you, Mr. Peterson. She's deaf." The storekeeper's jovial expression faltered, replaced by the awkward discomfort Rhett had come to recognize and despise. "Oh, I see. Well, that's unfortunate." Before Rhett could respond, Bethany touched his arm lightly, then handed him her slate. She'd written, "Please tell him I can read and write if he wishes to communicate." Rhett relayed the message, and to Peterson's credit, he quickly adjusted, writing down the prices of goods and answering Bethany's written questions about items available for order. By the time they left with their supplies, the storekeeper was treating Bethany with respectful normalcy. Their next stop was less pleasant. Mrs. Winters, the postmistress and self-appointed guardian of town morality, made no attempt to hide her disapproval when she learned of Bethany's condition. "Really, Mr. Morgan," she said, ignoring Bethany entirely, "I don't see how this arrangement can possibly work. Did you know about her affliction when you sent for her?" Rhett felt anger rise in his chest. "Miss Collins is standing right here, Mrs. Winters. And while she can't hear your rudeness, she can certainly see it." The postmistress flushed. "I merely meant that life out here is difficult enough for those with all their faculties. It seems cruel to bring someone with such limitations to the frontier." Bethany touched Rhett's arm again, her expression calm but determined. She wrote on her slate and showed it directly to Mrs. Winters. "I may not hear, but I see, think, and feel completely. Please don't speak about me as if I'm not present." Mrs. Winters had the grace to look abashed, mumbling an apology before quickly handing over Rhett's mail. As they left the post office, Rhett noticed Bethany's hands were trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. Their final stop was the small church at the edge of town, where Rhett had occasional business with Reverend Thomas, who also served as the town's doctor. The Reverend was working in his garden when they arrived, and his welcome was genuine. "Miss Collins, I've been hoping to meet you," he said, then paused when Rhett explained about Bethany's deafness. Unlike the others, Reverend Thomas showed neither pity nor discomfort. Instead, he pulled out a handkerchief to wipe his soil-covered hands, then surprised them both by forming his fingers into specific shapes. Bethany's face lit up with astonishment and joy. Her hands moved in response, forming similar shapes. "You know hand signs?" Rhett asked, watching their exchange with amazement. The Reverend nodded. "My sister lost her hearing after a childhood illness. Our parents sent her to a school in Philadelphia where she learned what they call sign language. I learned some to communicate with her." He turned to Bethany. "My signing is rusty, but I believe Miss Collins just told me she learned some signs at the asylum but had few people to practice with." Bethany nodded eagerly, her hands moving again. "She says she's forgotten much of it over the years," Reverend Thomas translated. "But it's coming back to her now." For the first time since her arrival, Rhett saw Bethany truly animated, her hands and face expressing thoughts without the constraints of the slate. Something twisted in his chest at the sight, a mixture of happiness for her joy and shame at his own limitations. The Reverend seemed to read his thoughts. "I have a book on sign language my parents purchased for our family. It's quite comprehensive, with illustrations. Would you like to borrow it, Mr. Morgan?" "Yes," Rhett said immediately. "Very much." On the ride home, Bethany's usual composure had given way to excitement. Several times she touched Rhett's arm to show him a sign, the gesture for tree as they passed a grove of cottonwoods, the motion for bird when a hawk circled overhead. Her happiness was contagious, and Rhett found himself laughing as he clumsily attempted to copy her movements. That evening, They pored over Reverend Thomas's book together at the kitchen table. The illustrated guide showed hand positions for hundreds of words, along with explanations of grammar that differed from spoken English. It was overwhelming, but Bethany's patience made it less daunting. She showed him the signs for basic needs first: water, food, help, then moved on to words they used daily around the ranch. By bedtime, Rhett's hands were cramping from practice, but he'd mastered nearly 24 signs. As the days passed, the book remained open on the table, consulted frequently by both of them. Rhett took to carrying the slate in his pocket for complex thoughts, but increasingly they communicated through a combination of signs and gestures. The ranch became filled with a language of their own, making part formal sign language, part invented signals specific to their needs. 2 weeks after Bethany's arrival, Rhett realized they hadn't discussed their original agreement. They were living together, working together, communicating more effectively each day, but the matter of marriage remained unaddressed. That night after supper, he took up the slate. "We should talk about our arrangement," he wrote. Bethany's expression grew guarded, but she nodded. "I paid for a bride," Rhett continued, wincing at how mercenary the words looked in chalk. "But I won't hold you to that contract if you're unhappy here." Bethany took the slate, her response careful but direct. "Are you unhappy with me?" "No," Rhett wrote immediately. "You've improved everything about this place. About my life." A faint blush colored Bethany's cheeks. "Then why do you hesitate to make me your wife?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. Indeed, why was he hesitating? The original shock of her deafness had long since faded. In its place had grown a deep admiration for her resilience, her intelligence, her quiet strength. And something else too, a warmth that spread through his chest when she smiled, a heightened awareness of her presence in any room. "I want you to be sure," he wrote finally. "Life here is hard, lonely, and people in town." He stopped, erased, and tried again. "I don't want you to feel trapped." Bethany considered his words, then wrote, "I chose this life. I chose to come west. I wasn't honest about my deafness, which was wrong, but everything else in my letters was true. I want a home. A family." She paused, then added, "I want to belong to someone who values me, not despite my silence, but as I am." Rhett stared at her words, feeling something shift and settle in his heart. Setting down the slate, he raised his hands and carefully signed, "I value you." His movements were clumsy, unpracticed, but Bethany's eyes widened in recognition. Her own hands responded, too quickly for him to follow completely, but her radiant smile conveyed her meaning clearly enough. Taking up the slate again, Rhett wrote, "Will you marry me, Bethany Collins?" "Properly, in the church, with Reverend Thomas?" Tears welled in Bethany's eyes as she nodded, then wrote beneath his question, "Yes, Rhett Morgan. I will marry you." The next week passed in a flurry of preparation. Rhett rode to town to speak with Reverend Thomas, who agreed to perform the ceremony the following Sunday. Bethany worked late into the nights on a new dress, transforming fabric she'd brought from Boston into a simple but elegant gown. On the morning of their wedding, Rhett woke early, his stomach tight with nerves. He shaved carefully, using the small mirror hanging by the wash basin, then put on his best shirt newly mended by Bethany's skilled hands. From beneath a floorboard in the barn, he retrieved a small wooden box containing his mother's wedding ring, preserved through war and hardship as his only family heirloom. They rode to town in the freshly painted wagon, Bethany radiant in her blue dress, a crown of wildflowers adorning her honey-brown curls. Rhett couldn't stop stealing glances at her, marveling at how this woman had transformed his life in less than a month. The church was unexpectedly full when they arrived. Word of the unusual wedding had spread through Whispering Pines, drawing curious onlookers. But to Rhett's relief and gratitude, there were friendly faces too: Mr. Peterson from the general store and his wife, several neighboring ranchers, even Dr. Wallace, who'd set Rhett's broken leg 2 winters ago. Reverend Thomas had prepared for the occasion, arranging a ceremony that acknowledged Bethany's deafness without making it a spectacle. He spoke the traditional words for the benefit of the congregation, while simultaneously signing them for Bethany. When it came time for their vows, Rhett carefully signed his promises, speaking them aloud as well, his hands steady despite his racing heart. Bethany's response was entirely in sign language, her hands forming the words with grace and certainty. Reverend Thomas translated for the congregation, but Rhett understood most of it himself, her pledge of loyalty, partnership, and love. When the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, Rhett gently lifted Bethany's hands and pressed a kiss to her fingers before sliding his mother's ring onto her slender hand. Then, mindful of the watching congregation but unable to restrain himself, he leaned down to kiss her lips, their first kiss, sweet and brief, but filled with promise. The small reception at the town hall afterward was surprisingly festive. Several women from town brought food, and someone produced a fiddle, soon filling the room with lively music. Though Bethany couldn't hear the tunes, she watched the dancers with evident enjoyment, her foot tapping in rhythm to vibrations she could feel through the wooden floor. To Rhett's surprise, Reverend Thomas's wife approached them with a gift, a book of poetry with inscriptions in both English and sign language. "My husband told me about your bride," she explained to Rhett. "I thought she might enjoy this. Poetry can be beautiful in signs, it's very expressive." Later, as the celebration continued, Rhett noticed Bethany in animated conversation with a young woman he recognized as the schoolteacher's daughter. To his astonishment, the girl was signing fluently. "My cousin is deaf," she explained when she saw Rhett watching. "I learned to sign as a child. I've been telling Mrs. Morgan about the deaf school in Denver where my cousin studied. They teach all sorts of subjects there." Bethany's eyes were bright with excitement as she signed to Rhett, her movements too quick for his limited vocabulary. The young woman laughed and translated. "Your wife says there are books on everything, science, literature, mathematics, all adapted for deaf students. She's asking if you might visit Denver someday." Rhett signed yes, without hesitation, rewarded by Bethany's brilliant smile. As the afternoon waned, they took their leave amid good wishes and gifts, practical items mostly, reflecting frontier practicality, but given with genuine warmth. The ride home was quiet, both of them tired but content, occasionally exchanging glances that needed no translation. At the ranch, Rhett helped Bethany from the wagon, then surprised her by sweeping her into his arms to carry her across the threshold. She laughed silently, her arms circling his neck as he navigated the doorway. Inside, he set her down gently, suddenly aware that this familiar cabin had transformed into something new, their home, truly shared now. That night, as husband and wife, they discovered a different kind of language, the silent communication of touch and tenderness, of questions asked and answered in caresses rather than words. Bethany's responsiveness surprised and delighted Rhett, her silence in these intimate moments feeling natural rather than unusual. Afterward, as she lay curled against his side, Rhett reflected on the strange journey that had brought them together. A month ago, he'd been a lonely rancher desperate enough to send for a stranger as a bride. Now he was a husband, his home warmed by a woman whose silence had initially seemed an insurmountable obstacle, but now felt like simply another facet of her unique self. As spring mellowed into summer, Bethany blossomed. The Reverend's book of sign language remained their most prized possession, consulted daily as Rhett's vocabulary expanded. Bethany proved to be an excellent teacher, patient but insistent on proper hand formations, her face lighting up whenever Rhett mastered a new concept. The ranch prospered under their joint care. Bethany's vegetable garden thrived, providing fresh produce that improved their simple meals. She learned to churn butter, make cheese, and preserve foods for the coming winter. Rhett found himself working with renewed purpose, making improvements to the cabin and outbuildings that he'd long neglected. In July, they rode to town for Independence Day celebrations. Rhett was pleased to see how differently the townspeople treated Bethany now. Mrs. Winters, the postmistress, greeted her with a carefully practiced sign for hello that made Bethany beam with pleasure. Several children approached her for lessons in finger spelling, fascinated by this new way of communicating. During the community picnic, Reverend Thomas sought them out with news. "A traveling teacher of the deaf will be passing through Helena next month," he told them. "She gives workshops for families with deaf members. It's a 3-day journey, but I thought you might be interested." Rhett translated the news into sign for Bethany, whose expression turned so hopeful that the decision was made instantly. "We'll go," Rhett told the Reverend. "Just tell us when." The trip to Helena in August was Bethany's first journey since arriving in Montana. She prepared for it with visible excitement. packing her best dress, and the journal where she'd been recording new signs they invented for ranch-specific terms. Helena was a shock after the quiet of Whispering Pines, a bustling territorial capital with brick buildings, boardwalks, and a surprising number of people. They stayed in a small hotel near the meeting hall where the workshops were to be held, Bethany clutching Rhett's hand tightly as they navigated the crowded streets. The teacher, Miss Eleanor Ramsey, was a formidable woman in her 50s who had devoted her life to deaf education. She herself was not deaf but had a brother who was. She explained to the assembled group an unexpected mix of families with deaf children, a few deaf adults with their hearing relatives, and even 2 doctors interested in communication methods. Over 3 intensive days, Miss Ramsey expanded their understanding of sign language enormously. She taught advanced grammatical concepts, explained the history and ongoing development of American Sign Language, and demonstrated teaching methods for different subjects. Most valuable for Rhett were the sessions with other hearing family members of deaf people. For the first time, he could discuss the challenges and rewards of their unique communication with others who truly understood. A farmer from Idaho shared his invention of ground-vibrating signals to warn his deaf wife of approaching riders, an idea Rhett immediately resolved to implement at their ranch. For Bethany, the workshop provided an even greater gift: connection with other deaf adults. On the second evening, Rhett watched from across the room as his normally reserved wife engaged in rapid, fluid conversation with a deaf couple from Wyoming. Her face was animated, her hands moving with a grace and complexity he'd never witnessed, occasionally punctuated by silent laughter. Later, in their hotel room, Bethany's hands couldn't move fast enough as she shared her excitement. She had to resort to writing several times when Rhett couldn't follow her signs. "They invited us to visit them in Cheyenne," she wrote. "They know 5 other deaf people there. They have social gatherings." Rhett smiled at her enthusiasm. "We'll go," he promised in sign. "Next year, when the cattle are sold." On their final day in Helena, Miss Ramsey gave them a parting gift: a newly published dictionary of signs with detailed illustrations and a set of picture cards developed for teaching deaf children to read. "Your wife has a quick mind," she told Rhett while Bethany was engaged with others. "With proper materials, there's nothing she couldn't learn. And you, Mr. Morgan, have a natural aptitude for signing. Many hearing people never achieve your fluency." Rhett felt a surge of pride at her words. "She's taught me more than signs," he admitted. "She's taught me to see the world differently." The return journey to Whispering Pines was filled with plans and dreams. Bethany wanted to order more books, to correspond with the deaf couple from Wyoming, to perhaps visit the school in Denver someday. Rhett, watching her animated signing, realized how isolated she must have felt before, not just on his remote ranch, but throughout her life. "I want to make you happy," he signed as they made camp one night under the vast Montana sky. Bethany's response was immediate. "I am happy," she signed, then added with a mischievous smile, "but I would be happier with a proper bath and our own bed." Rhett laughed, pulling her close. "Tomorrow," he promised. "Home tomorrow." Autumn brought the cattle drive, Rhett's annual journey to the railroad town of Billings to sell most of his herd. In previous years, he dreaded leaving the ranch unattended, but now Bethany would be there. Still, he worried about her safety alone for nearly 2 weeks. "I'll be fine," she insisted, demonstrating the rifle skills he'd taught her over the summer. "The nearest neighbors are only 4 miles away if there's trouble." Despite her assurances, Rhett arranged for young Robert Peterson, the storekeeper's 16-year-old son, to stay in the barn and help with chores during his absence. The boy was reliable and respectful, and he'd picked up basic signs quickly during the Morgans' visits to town. The night before his departure, Rhett held Bethany close, memorizing the feel of her in his arms, the scent of her hair, the sound of her breathing, the only sound she made besides occasional humming vibrations she couldn't hear. In the darkness, he whispered aloud the words he usually signed, "I love you." Though she couldn't hear them, saying them aloud made them no less true. The cattle drive was hard work, but successful. Beef prices were high, and Rhett's careful breeding program had produced quality stock that fetched top dollar. After expenses, he had more cash than he'd expected, enough to consider some of the improvements they discussed. Before leaving Billings, he made several purchases that required the full capacity of the supply wagon. He brought along window glass for the cabin's currently oil paper-covered windows, a better cookstove to replace their ancient one, books Bethany had requested, fabric for new curtains and winter clothes, and a special surprise he'd ordered months earlier. The return journey seemed endless. Rhett pushed himself and the team harder than was wise, eager to return home not to a silent, empty cabin as in years past, but to Bethany's welcoming presence. He arrived just after sunset on the 12th day, the team lathered from his insistence on completing the journey rather than camping one more night. As the wagon approached, the cabin door flew open, and Bethany ran out, her face alight with joy. Rhett barely had time to set the brake before she was beside the wagon, reaching for him. He jumped down and swept her into his arms, fatigue forgotten as he swung her in a circle, both of them laughing his audible, her silent, but no less real. "I missed you," he signed when he finally set her down. "Show me how much," she signed back, her eyes sparkling with mischief. Later, after a proper reunion and a late supper, Rhett brought in his special purchase from the wagon, a gleaming new sewing machine, far superior to the ancient treadle model Bethany had been using. Her eyes widened at the sight, hands flying in excited questions about its features and capabilities. "There's something else," Rhett signed, enjoying her excitement. "In Billings, I met a man who owns a dry goods store. He sells clothes and linens to the hotels and restaurants. When I mentioned your sewing skills, he was interested. He'll pay for quality tablecloths, napkins, and bed linens, all items you could make here, and send with the monthly supply wagon." Bethany's expression turned thoughtful as she considered the proposition. Then she signed, "My own business?" Rhett nodded. "Your own money, too. Whatever you earn is yours." Her response was to throw her arms around him, her kiss conveying her feelings more eloquently than any signs could have. The winter of 1876-77 was harsh, with heavy snowfalls isolating the ranch for weeks at a time. But unlike previous winters, when Rhett had endured the isolation and grim solitude, the cabin was warm with shared companionship. Bethany's sewing enterprise flourished, with the new machine allowing her to produce finely crafted items that brought praise and steady orders from the Billings merchant. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire reading, sometimes separately, sometimes together, from the growing collection of books that now filled a proper bookshelf Rhett had built. Bethany particularly loved poetry, often signing favorite verses with such expressiveness that Rhett found them more beautiful in her silent rendition than in spoken word. They developed games to pass the time, checkers, card games, and a makeshift version of charades that had them both collapsing in laughter at their attempts to convey complex ideas through pantomime. It was during one such evening of easy companionship that Bethany set aside her sewing and signed with deliberate casualness, "I have something to tell you." Something in her expression made Rhett's heart quicken. "What is it?" Her hands formed the sign slowly, a smile spreading across her face. "I believe we will have a child in summer." For a moment, Rhett couldn't move, the impact of her words freezing him in place. Then he was across the room, kneeling before her chair, his hands on her still flat stomach, his face lifted to hers in wonder and question. Bethany nodded, covering his hands with her own. "I'm sure," she signed. "I've known for nearly a month, but wanted to be certain before telling you. A child. Their child." The possibility had been there from the beginning, of course, but somehow the reality of it struck Rhett with unexpected force. Joy mingled with sudden, sharp fear. "The baby," he signed, his hands slightly unsteady. "Will it be?" He couldn't finish the question, but Bethany understood. "Deaf," she supplied. "It's possible. My deafness came from illness, not birth, so our child will likely hear. But if not—" Her hands paused, then continued firmly. "If not, we of all people will know how to love a deaf child." The simple wisdom of her response humbled him. Of course they would. Whatever challenges their child might face, they would face them together, just as they had faced the challenges of building their marriage across the divide of silence. As winter gave way to spring, Bethany's body changed, her slender frame softening with the new life growing inside her. Rhett found himself watching her with a protective tenderness that sometimes made her laugh and sigh. "I'm with child, not made of glass." But she indulged his protectiveness, understanding that it stemmed from love and the memory of his mother's death in childbirth, a story he'd shared during the long winter nights. In May, as Bethany entered her 6th month, Rhett insisted on a trip to town to consult with Dr. Wallace. The doctor examined Bethany thoroughly, communicating through written notes and Rhett's translations, and pronounced her in excellent health. "The baby is positioned properly, good strong heartbeat," he told Rhett. "Your wife is young and strong. There's every reason to expect a normal delivery." Relieved but still anxious, Rhett arranged for the doctor to stay at the ranch during Bethany's confinement in August. It was an expensive arrangement, but one that brought peace of mind that no amount of money could match. As Bethany's time grew nearer, the ranch received an unexpected visitor. Reverend Thomas arrived one afternoon in late July, bringing news of a death in his extended family that would require his absence from Whispering Pines through August. "I was concerned about leaving just before Mrs. Morgan's confinement," he explained, "but I've brought someone who might be of assistance." From the Reverend's wagon stepped an elderly woman with iron gray hair and weathered features that spoke of a lifetime on the frontier. "This is Mrs. Harper," Reverend Thomas introduced her. "She served as midwife to most of the children born in Whispering Pines over the last 20 years, including some of mine. She's agreed to stay at your ranch until the baby comes." Rhett was momentarily taken aback by this arrangement made without his consultation, but Bethany's obvious relief and pleasure at meeting the midwife convinced him of its wisdom. Mrs. Harper, it turned out, had a deaf nephew and knew basic signs, which she demonstrated immediately to Bethany's delight. "I'll leave her with you, then," the Reverend said, preparing to depart. "Mrs. Harper has delivered over 100 babies without losing a mother yet. Your wife is in good hands." With both the doctor and midwife in residence, the small ranch took on the atmosphere of an expectant household. Mrs. Harper immediately took charge of domestic arrangements, freeing Bethany from the more strenuous chores while teaching her what to expect during labor and delivery. Dr. Wallace, meanwhile, spent his days fishing in the creek, reading medical journals on the porch, and occasionally helping Rhett with ranch work. His calm presence and medical knowledge were reassuring, even as his bill mounted with each passing day. On August 10, 1877, Bethany woke Rhett before dawn with an insistent touch. Her face was both excited and apprehensive as she signed, "It's beginning." The next 18 hours were the longest of Rhett's life. Banned from the bedroom by Mrs. Harper, he paced the small cabin, occasionally allowed brief visits to Bethany's side, where he would hold her hand through contractions she couldn't vocalize but clearly felt. Dr. Wallace assured him repeatedly that everything was progressing normally, if slowly, for a first birth. "Your wife is doing splendidly," he said during one of Rhett's more anxious moments. "Mrs. Harper says she's never seen such quiet determination." As dusk fell, Bethany's labor intensified. Rhett, relegated to the porch with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, stared at the darkening landscape without seeing it. Every fiber of his being was attuned to the cabin behind him, to the woman laboring in silence to bring their child into the world. Just as the first stars appeared, Dr. Wallace opened the door. "Mr. Morgan," he said quietly, "your wife is asking for you." Rhett bolted inside, his heart in his throat. In the bedroom, lit by several oil lamps, Bethany lay propped against pillows, her face drawn with exhaustion but radiant. In her arms was a small bundle. "You have a daughter," Mrs. Harper announced, her weathered face creased in a smile. "A perfect little girl." Rhett approached the bed on unsteady legs, sinking down beside Bethany to gaze in wonder at the tiny face nestled against her breast. The baby's eyes were closed, her small features scrunched in the bewilderment of new life. A dusting of dark hair covered her perfectly formed head. "She's beautiful," he signed one-handed, his other hand gently touching his daughter's cheek. "Like her mother." Bethany's tired face lit with a smile. "Do you want to hold her?" With infinite care, Rhett took the swaddled infant into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, this new life they'd created together. As he cradled her, the baby's eyes opened unfocused but seemingly looking directly at him, a gaze that pierced straight to his heart. "Hello, little one," he whispered, knowing Bethany couldn't hear his words but needing to speak them aloud. "Welcome to the world." The baby squirmed slightly, her tiny mouth opening in what might have been a yawn or a silent protest at being disturbed. Rhett felt an overwhelming surge of love and protectiveness, a fierce determination that this child would never know the loneliness or hardship that had marked both her parents' early lives. "What shall we name her?" he signed to Bethany. They had discussed names during the long winter evenings, but never settled on choices for either a boy or girl. Now, looking at their daughter's delicate features, Bethany signed, "Rose." For new beginnings. Rose Morgan. Rhett tried the name aloud, then signed it. "It's perfect." In the days that followed, the small cabin adjusted to its newest inhabitant. Mrs. Harper stayed another week, teaching Bethany the arts of nursing and infant care. Dr. Wallace departed after ensuring mother and child were thriving, his substantial bill paid in full from the proceeds of Bethany's sewing business. Rhett found himself fascinated by his tiny daughter. He would spend hours just watching her sleep in the cradle he'd crafted, marveling at her perfect fingers and toes, the delicate curve of her ear, the rosebud mouth that resembled Bethany's. When Rose was 2 weeks old, he rode to town with the news, distributing cigars at the general store and accepting congratulations from everyone he encountered. Reverend Thomas, recently returned from his journey, promised to ride out to the ranch soon to perform a proper christening. Life settled into a new rhythm centered around Rose's needs. Bethany proved to be a natural mother, patient and attentive. She began signing to the baby immediately, her hands forming simple words, mother, father, love, as she went about her daily tasks with Rose in a sling across her chest. "She's too young to understand," Rhett signed one evening, amused by Bethany's one-sided conversations with their infant daughter. "She's learning language," Bethany responded confidently. "All babies watch faces and hands. She'll learn signs before she can speak." As autumn painted the landscape in golds and reds, Rose grew and thrived. She was an alert baby, her eyes tracking movement, her small face lighting up in recognition when either parent came into view. By November, she was smiling first at Bethany, then a week later at Rhett, a gummy grin that melted his heart anew. Their first Christmas as a family was simple but joyful. Rhett cut a small pine tree from the higher elevations of their property, and Bethany decorated it with paper ornaments and strings of dried berries. They exchanged modest gifts, a new winter coat for Rhett sewn secretly by Bethany, a rocking chair Rhett had commissioned from the carpenter in town for Bethany to nurse Rose in comfort. As they sat before the fire that Christmas night, Rose sleeping peacefully in her cradle nearby, Rhett found himself reflecting on the extraordinary changes of the past year. 12 months ago, he had been alone, his future stretching before him in bleak solitude. Now his small cabin was filled with family, a wife who understood him in ways no speaking woman ever could, a daughter whose existence still seemed miraculous. Taking Bethany's hand in his, he signed, "Thank you." Her eyebrows lifted in question. "For what?" "For answering my advertisement. For taking a chance on a stranger. For not giving up when things were difficult at first." Bethany's expression softened. "I should thank you. You didn't send me away when you learned I was deaf." Rhett shook his head, then signed carefully, wanting to be precise. "I almost did. I was afraid. Afraid you couldn't survive here, afraid of the effort it would take to communicate. I was selfish and ignorant. But you learned." Bethany signed, her movements gentle. "You tried. That's more than anyone else ever did." Rhett thought of the words she'd written on her slate all those months ago. "No one ever wanted me." How wrong those men had been, those fools who had rejected her because of her silence. Their loss had become his immeasurable gain. "I want you," he signed, then corrected himself. "No, I love you. I love our life together. I love our daughter." In response, Bethany rose from her chair and settled onto his lap, her head nestling against his shoulder. Against his chest, he felt rather than heard her contented sigh, a vibration that spoke of happiness more eloquently than words. As Rose grew from infant to toddler, Rhett and Bethany's predictions both proved true. The child could hear her startled response to sudden noises had confirmed that early on, but her first communications were indeed in sign language. By 15 months, her small hands could form recognizable signs for milk, more, and up, along with identifying both parents. Her first spoken word came at 18 months, "Papa." directed at Rhett when he returned from a day's work on the far pastures. The sound of her voice, clear and bell-like in the cabin's quiet, brought tears to his eyes. Bethany, who had been watching their daughter's lips form sounds she herself couldn't hear, signed excitedly. What did she say? Papa. Rhett signed back, his hands shaking slightly with emotion. She called me Papa. The look of pure joy on Bethany's face banished any fear he might have harbored that she would feel excluded by their daughter's emerging speech. Instead, she knelt beside Rose, encouraging her to repeat the word, her hands signing Papa as the child vocalized. From that day forward, Rose developed into a child of two worlds, the speaking world of her father and the town, and the silent world of signs she shared with her mother. By the age of 3, she moved effortlessly between these realms, sometimes signing and speaking simultaneously, sometimes choosing one mode of communication over the other depending on her audience. The ranch prospered during these years. Rhett's careful breeding program improved his herd's quality, while Bethany's sewing business expanded to include custom clothing for several wealthy families in Billings. Their financial security allowed for improvements to the ranch, a proper barn to replace the original rough structure, in addition to the cabin providing a separate bedroom for Rose, even a piano purchased secondhand when Rose showed an interest in music. In the summer of 1881, shortly after Rose's 4th birthday, Bethany made another announcement that changed their family. I'm expecting again, she signed one evening after Rose had been tucked into bed. In winter this time. The news brought both joy and renewed anxiety for Rhett. Bethany's first delivery, though ultimately successful, had been long and difficult. But Dr. Wallace, now a regular visitor to the ranch whenever he had patients in the area, assured them that second births were typically easier. Besides, he told Rhett, your wife is stronger now than she was 4 years ago. She's been working alongside you on this ranch, not confined in city lodgings as she was before Rose. Rose was fascinated by her mother's changing body, placing her small hands on Bethany's growing belly to feel the baby's movements. Bethany patiently explained in sign and encouraged Rose to talk to the baby, explaining that while Mama couldn't hear her voice, the baby inside could. On a snowy January morning in 1882, Rhett woke to find Bethany already up and moving purposefully around the cabin, preparing for the day ahead. When he signed a question, she replied simply, the baby is coming. I've sent Rose to fetch Mrs. Harper. Their daughter, mature beyond her years, had indeed bundled up and set off toward the neighbor's ranch where Mrs. Harper was staying in anticipation of the birth. Rhett was simultaneously proud of Rose's responsibility and alarmed that his 4-year-old had ventured alone into the snowy landscape. His fears proved groundless when Rose returned an hour later with Mrs. Harper in tow, both pink-cheeked from the cold, but otherwise fine. The midwife took one look at Bethany and announced that this baby was in a hurry to arrive. She was right. By mid-afternoon, Bethany gave birth to a son, a robust boy with a shock of dark hair and a lusty cry that could be heard throughout the cabin. Unlike his sister's long delivery, Rebecca James Morgan arrived after just 6 hours of labor, eager to join the family that awaited him. Rose was enchanted with her baby brother, appointing herself his special guardian and interpreter. I'll teach him to sign for Mama, she declared solemnly, and to speak for Papa. As James, as they called him, grew, it became apparent that he had inherited not only his father's dark coloring, but also his mother's quick intelligence. By his 1st birthday, he too was communicating in sign before speech, absorbing the silent language that filled his home alongside spoken English. In the spring of 1885, with Rose approaching 8 and James 3, a letter arrived that would open yet another chapter in their lives. It was from the Wyoming couple they had met in Helena years earlier, announcing the establishment of a school for deaf children in Cheyenne. We remember your interest in deaf education, they wrote. The school will open this fall with 15 students already enrolled. We are seeking teachers who are fluent in sign language, both deaf and hearing. We thought immediately of Mrs. Morgan. Bethany read the letter with growing excitement, her hands flying as she translated its contents for Rhett. They want me to teach, she signed, her expression a mixture of disbelief and joy. Me, a teacher? Rhett watched her enthusiasm with mixed emotions. The thought of Bethany leaving the ranch, even temporarily, created a hollow feeling in his chest. Yet he couldn't deny the opportunity. This represented a chance for her to use her intelligence and language skills to help others like herself. Would you want to go? He signed carefully. Bethany's response surprised him. Not alone, she signed. Never without you and the children. But perhaps we could all go? For a year. The idea was radical. Leave the ranch for a year? Rhett's first instinct was to refuse outright. The ranch was their livelihood, their security. Yet as Bethany elaborated on her vision, renting the ranch to their neighbor's son who had long expressed interest, taking Rose and James to a larger community where they could attend proper schools, the chance for all of them to meet more deaf people and expand their understanding of that world, he found himself reconsidering. Let me think about it, he signed finally. It's a big decision. For weeks, Rhett wrestled with the proposal. He consulted with neighboring ranchers, with the bank in town, with Reverend Thomas. Gradually, a plan took shape that seemed feasible: a one-year absence, with the ranch leased to young William Peterson, now 25 and eager to prove himself. Their cattle herds temporarily merged with the neighbors for more efficient management. By midsummer, the decision was made. The Morgan family would spend a year in Cheyenne, with Bethany teaching at the deaf school, while Rhett found temporary work in the growing city. Rose and James would attend regular school, broadening their experiences beyond the isolated ranch life they'd known. The children received the news with characteristic differences: Rose with excited questions about city life and the promise of other children to play with, James with quiet acceptance and trust in his parents' judgment. As they prepared for their temporary relocation, selling or storing unnecessary possessions and making arrangements for the ranch's care, Rhett found himself increasingly at peace with the decision. This wasn't an ending, but an expansion, a chance for Bethany to share her gifts with others who needed them, for the children to gain experiences that would enrich their lives, for himself to see his wife flourish in new ways. On their final evening at the ranch before departure, Rhett and Bethany stood on the porch, watching the sunset paint the familiar landscape in gold and crimson. The children were already asleep inside, exhausted from the day's preparations. "Are you afraid?" Rhett signed, noting the pensive expression on Bethany's face. She considered the question before responding. "A little," she admitted. "I've never taught before. What if I fail?" Rhett shook his head firmly. "You won't fail. You taught me to sign when I knew nothing. You've taught our children 2 languages. You have a gift for making the complex clear." Bethany smiled at his confidence, but signed. "It's different with family. These will be strangers' children. Children who need what you can give them," Rhett countered. "A model of what a deaf adult can achieve. Knowledge that their silence doesn't limit their potential." As darkness fell around them, Bethany leaned against Rhett's shoulder, her body warm against his in the cooling evening air. Together they had built a life that neither could have imagined 9 years earlier: a marriage across the divide of silence, a family fluent in 2 languages, a home filled with understanding that transcended ordinary communication. Tomorrow they would embark on a new adventure, temporary but significant. They would take their unique family into a larger world, sharing the lessons they had learned through years of patience, creativity, and love. But tonight, in the deepening Montana twilight, they simply stood together on the porch of the home they had made, hand in hand, no words or signs needed between them. Their journey had begun with a desperate advertisement and a courageous response, with a deaf woman who believed no one would ever want her, and a lonely rancher who had learned to say, "I do," with his hands instead of his voice. It had continued through challenges and joys, through the birth of children who bridged their different worlds, through daily discoveries of new ways to communicate what mattered most. And now it would expand beyond the boundaries of their ranch, carrying the language of their love to others who needed to learn it. As the first stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Rhett turned to face Bethany directly. In the dim light, he signed the words that had become the foundation of their life together, 3 simple movements that had once been foreign to him, but now felt as natural as breathing. "I love you." Bethany's hands formed the response she had signed countless times over their years together, her eyes luminous in the gathering darkness. "I love you too." And in that moment, as throughout their extraordinary journey, the silence between them was not an obstacle, but a sacred space filled not with emptiness, but with understanding deeper than words could express, with a love that had learned to speak in a language all its own.